She was discovered just steps from the back door, silent, crumpled, and unresponsive. Her name was Stephanie Steenburgin Davenport, and it was her husband, Joshua, who found her, and called it a suicide. But as the blue lights cut through the Kentucky dusk, detectives began to sense something was off. The scene didn't feel right. 2 hours later, the calm suburban afternoon had shifted into a silent storm of questions. Joshua's 911 call, trembling, breathless, became the first crack in his story. "She's not moving," he whispered. Yet even in that moment, 2 words echoed like a verdict: not moving. Not breathing. Not alive. And so begins the unraveling. This is True Crime Tangles, real stories, real people, and the moments that changed everything. Today, Stephanie Steenburgin Davenport, and the husband whose version of events would soon collapse under the weight of evidence. In southeastern Kentucky, Laurel County spreads across rolling hills and quiet mountain valleys. Established in 1825 and home to roughly 63,000 people, this community finds strength in shared history and everyday familiarity here. Towns like London and small outposts like Corbin are woven together by common roots: coal and timber, narrow backroads, local church congregations, and the annual World Chicken Festival that draws thousands each year. Corbin, where the Davenports have made their home, seems a picturesque snapshot of Southern life. Small storefronts lined Main Street, historic railroad ties, and even the Harlan Sanders Cafe, the birthplace of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Yet beneath that facade of normalcy, stories both personal and hidden played out behind closed doors. Stephanie Steenburgin and Joshua Davenport moved into a modest house just off North Florence Street. She was 38 years old, known to family as warm-hearted and gentle, quick with a laugh and eager to build a quieter life after past challenges. Joshua was also 38, and while he seemed committed to his marriage, whispers had begun to circle, rumors of some rough history, old arrests tied to drug possession and addiction. On the surface, they appeared to be living an ordinary life, attending local church, greets at community fundraisers, and decorating their home for holidays. But those closest to Stephanie, especially her mother, felt unease. She confided that the shadows of Joshua's past were never far behind, hinting at quiet arguments and occasional tension when old memories resurfaced. 5 months into their marriage, many in town still believed in their future. But even amid decorations and picture frames, something was beginning to strain. It wasn't visible to passerby or to the church portraits, only known to the circle inside the walls: a tension in the unspoken pauses, a sharp edge when arguments flared. In a county that remembers its own, a couple like the Davenports caught attention not by fame or scandal, but by their ordinariness, and by how radically that quiet was shattered one afternoon in March 2018. No one could have predicted how fragile the story they'd built together would prove to be. This is the world they tried to build, a small-town marriage on stable ground. But as we'll see, it was not enough to stop what came next. March 7, 2018 began like any other day in this quiet Laurel County neighborhood. By midday, though, a 911 call would change everything. At 12:16 p.m., Joshua's mother placed the urgent call. "I think my son's wife is dead," her voice shaking. Within minutes, deputies were en route to a modest house on North Florence Street, just outside London, Kentucky. When the first patrol car pulled in at approximately 12:34 p.m., they found Joshua pacing on the porch. He looked pale, his hands trembling. He told officers, "She took her own life." But behind the house lay a different story. Stephanie Steenburgin Davenport, age 38, lay lifeless in the grass, multiple gunshot wounds ending a life and prompting 1,000 questions. Near her body lay a .38 caliber Rossi pistol. Police tagged it carefully. Joshua said that she used the weapon on herself. Yet, forensic investigators saw inconsistencies in angle and entry, as if the pistol had never been in her grasp. Each shell casing, each entry point, each thread of blood, collectively, this evidence began to paint a different picture. Detectives swiftly secured Joshua's phone records. Among the endless scroll of notifications lay a discrepancy. no searches for suicide help, no frantic texts to family. Just the same morning text to Stephanie, a check-in like any other day. But no one could confirm what had happened. The silence behind the house seemed louder than any accusation. Joshua stayed motionless, repeating that Stephanie had taken her own life. But officers were collecting every detail, the weapon, the positioning, the gunshot wounds, looking for answers Stephanie no longer could give. As law enforcement moved past the initial shock, what began as a suspected suicide shifted into a carefully unfolding homicide investigation. Ballistics and wound analysis formed the backbone of the early investigation. Detectives and medical examiners noted that Stephanie had been shot multiple times in the back and side, a pattern starkly inconsistent with a self-inflicted injury. Investigators pressed on, why would anyone shoot themselves repeatedly, and from angles that would be exceedingly difficult to reach? Joshua Davenport stuck to his original claim, Stephanie had taken her own life. Over a series of interrogations, he reiterated this version. But detectives picked up on fleeting inconsistencies. Narrative gaps growing clearer with each question. Police records from the indictment confirmed Joshua held tightly to the suicide narrative even as the evidence grew stronger that foul play was involved. The medical examiner's report revealed at least 2 separate entry wounds behind the home. One bullet struck in a trajectory that, according to ballistic experts, would be nearly impossible for Stephanie to have self-inflicted. Investigators concluded the scene was brazenly staged to look like suicide. Crime scene photographers documented signs suggesting the scene had been altered. Shell casings moved, the placement of the Rossi .38 pistol adjusted, grass flattened around the body, all signs that someone had attempted to fabricate a suicide scene. That led to the additional tampering charge in Joshua's indictment. Detectives tested out potential scenarios, a domestic argument spiraling violently, perhaps fueled by past struggles with substance misuse. Witnesses later testified that Joshua and Stephanie had fought earlier that afternoon, and Joshua had a known history of drug arrests. While this didn't appear in police documents as a primary motive, conversation in the community echoed these tensions. Local residents, rattled by the severity of the crime, came forward with key information. Some reported hearing raised voices that midday, others mentioned seeing Joshua pacing in distress on the front porch after the gunfire. Investigators reviewed traffic and surveillance cameras in nearby intersections, but found no contradictory leads. No third party was ever implicated. The scene, it seemed, pointed only to Joshua. Early theories included accidental shooting, perhaps during a suicide attempt gone wrong, but no evidence supported this. Another line of inquiry considered retaliation or hidden enemies, given Joshua's background, but those leads fizzled without connections or suspects. With each theory quietly dismissed, investigators focused back on what evidence clearly showed: Stephanie had been killed intentionally, and a suicide narrative had been carefully constructed. By the time detectives closed out their investigation, the case against Joshua had shifted dramatically. What began as a domestic tragedy had become a carefully assembled case pointing squarely to homicide, backed by ballistic facts, tampered crime scene evidence, and Joshua's unverified explanations. At approximately 3:42 p.m. on the same day Stephanie's body was discovered, Joshua Tate Davenport was placed in handcuffs by Detective Kyle Gray of the Laurel County Sheriff's Office. He was taken into custody on suspicion of murder, as the homicide investigation began in earnest. Prosecutors charged Davenport with first-degree murder in connection with his wife's death, along with an additional count of tampering with physical evidence. Stemming from signs he had altered the crime scene inside the courtroom, a series of key testimonies shaped the narrative. Detectives outlined the arrival and initial findings, explaining why they believed this was not a suicide. Forensic experts described the trajectories of the bullets, and how the entry wounds in the back contradicted any self-infliction theory. They added that the placement of the .38 Rossi pistol behind Stephanie suggested it had been planted, not dropped naturally. Family members, including Joshua's mother, recounted arguments they'd overheard earlier that day, offering context on the couple's strained relationship. Joshua maintained his innocence, repeating that Stephanie had taken her own life and asserting that he'd found her behind the house. He contested forensic interpretations, arguing that all evidence could still fit a suicide scenario. The state's case relied on three pillars. 1. The autopsy report, detailing multiple wounds inconsistent with self-infliction. 2. Ballistics and scene reconstruction, showing the trajectory and positioning of the gun, and the likely staging. 3. Crime scene evidence, including shell casings and a body placement that did not align with Joshua's version of events. In early September 2019, a jury reached its decision, guilty on both counts, murder and evidence tampering. Murder, 35 years; tampering, 5 years, to run consecutively. Total prison sentence, 40 years behind bars. This courtroom showdown laid bare the twin truths of the Davenport case. First, that Stephanie could not have shot herself. Second, that the crime scene had been manipulated. With the jury's verdict now official, the investigation moved from fieldwork into the archives. But for family and community, the shots fired on that March day resonated as a definitive end to a life many had loved. Nearly 6 years after Stephanie's death, Joshua Tate Davenport sits in a Kentucky state penitentiary, serving a 40-year sentence, 35 years for murder and 5 years for tampering, without parole. Despite his appeal to the Kentucky Supreme Court, the convictions and sentences were upheld in September 2020. Stephanie's family, while deeply scarred by the loss, has remained largely private. Local news outlets report that her loved ones have quietly advocated for stronger protections against domestic violence, channeling their grief into action, even as they continue to grieve in the hush of remembrance. Domestic violence experts note that a single heated argument can escalate rapidly, especially when old patterns of substance abuse are involved. Joshua's past, including drug-related arrests and a short period of incarceration ending just weeks before Stephanie's death, emerged as key elements fueling tension. Some psychologists suggest that when domestic distress intersects with addiction, the risk of impulsive violence can skyrocket, and that staging the scene as suicide indicates a disordered attempt at evasion, rather than rational calculation. The staged placement of the pistol, the altered shell casings, all point to a man scrambling to reframe his actions as anything but deliberate. Speculation has centered on whether Joshua acted alone, or if deeper motives played a role. Some fringe theories point to purported drug dealings, linking Joshua to past arrests. But investigators found no evidence of drug transactions linked to Stephanie or the day of her death. Instead, both the prosecution and defense agreed. No third party was involved. No credible suspect ever emerged. It came back to one narrative: Stephanie was killed in their home, by her husband, and that man tried to cover it up with a staged suicide. Following the conviction, Laurel County experienced both a surge of relief and reflection. Editorials in the London Sentinel praised the swift resolution but also highlighted the warning signs that went unnoticed. Fears, bruises, tensions, ultimately believed to be symbolic of much larger domestic violence issues in rural Kentucky. Local nonprofits report that calls to hotlines increased in the months afterward, as more women came forward seeking help. The case, they say, reminded the community that violence behind closed doors doesn't always announce itself. A few residents continue to ask, could Joshua truly have been that composed in the aftermath? Could an engine of desperation overtake him? The forensic record, the witnesses' testimony, the burden of proof, all pointed to homicide. But on dark Kentucky nights, when the wind rattles the farmhouse windows, some wonder whether the full truth will ever be laid bare. The Davenport case didn't just end in a courtroom. It left a trail of grief, a community asking why, and questions about domestic shadows that so many homes carry. But one thing remains: Stephanie is gone. And those 40 years behind bars are all that stand between the memory of her and the man who claimed he never meant to kill her. A woman is gone. Her name was Stephanie Steenburgin Davenport. She was 38 years old, a daughter, a mother, a wife for only 5 months. She lived in a small Kentucky town, in a quiet house off North Florence Street. And on a single afternoon in March 2018, her life ended behind that home, abruptly, violently. The story we followed. Of a marriage turned tragic, of investigations and indictments, of grief stretched across a community, ends not in clarity, but in consequence. 40 years. A verdict rendered. A man behind bars. A family forever altered. And still, questions echo. Did the court hear everything that should have been heard? Did fear, addiction, or desperation shape the final moments of Stephanie's life? Or was it simply rage and control, as the prosecutors claimed? Some will always wonder if those final seconds held a struggle no one else saw. We remember Stephanie not by the way she died, but by the life that was cut short. If there are warning signs of domestic violence, we must listen. If someone you know is afraid, pay attention. Sometimes the quietest homes hide the most dangerous silences. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case, or are there still questions left unanswered? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more deep investigations into justice and tragedy. This has been True Crime Tangles.